welcome back for chapter 10 of Toliver's Secret. If you got your notes that you've been taking, grab those and listen in. Hold back the night, Ellen said over and over as they rode along. She watched the trees stand back against the dull red sunset. Slowly the sky faded into gray and then turned into night. She thought anxiously of Mr. Shannon's courier and wondered how long he would wait. Was he watching the few stars that came out of the wintry sky? It must be a long, long ride from Elizabeth to Pennsylvania. If the general was to have the message tomorrow, the first courier would have to start soon. Grandfather would have been there long ago had he come. It had grown very dark when Mr. Murdock turned his head to her and spoke over his shoulder. "It's black as pitch. You better sleep in the loft with my boys tonight." "Oh, no," cried Ellen. "I couldn't do that. How are you going to get to Elizabeth?" Ellen took a long breath. "Walk," she said in a very low voice. Then she remembered the coins in her pocket. "Mr. Murdock," she said, "I can pay you to ride me to Elizabeth." "Well," the farmer thought it over, but he said no more. "I have the money. I'll give it to you." You guys are going to laugh. I just poked myself in the eye. If you were in class, you would laugh with me. Let's try that again. Sorry, got a little blurry. "I have the money," Ellen urged him. "I'll give it all to you." Well... Would he ever make up his mind? "You said it was only a half a mile," she reminded him. "Well, see what Ma says first. I have to feed my 2 cows in the woods, and they'll be bellowing to be milked. Then I have to round up my pigs and tie them up." And then we could start?" asked Ellen. "Well, Mom will be mighty mad if we don't sit down to her supper. Ma gets mad easy. But I reckon I can take you when I get through." Perhaps Ellen thought she'd better hurry on by herself. After all the trouble she had today, it would be terrible if she missed the courier. But then she heard the lonesome howl of an animal far away and quickly changed her mind. Surely the courier would not start this early. "It won't be so late," she kept assuring herself. She could smell the wood smoke from the chimney before she saw the shadowy house near the road. It, too, was tightly closed with no light showing from the windows. "Well, we're here," said Mr. Murdock as he turned through the gate. He tied the horse up to ring a bell in the wall. "Open up, I'm home again," he shouted. The door was flung wide and 2 young boys ran out. In the dim light, Ellen could see a big black pig tied by his hind legs to a stake just outside the door. "Oh, Pa," the boys shouted as they gathered up the baskets. "We found this mean old pig in the woods and we tied him up." "Good," said the farmer. "We'll turn him into pork tomorrow." A tall, lanky woman came to the door and held it open for them. Her eyes were angry, and her face, beneath a ruffled white cap, looked as if it were hacked out of gray stone. She bounced a crying baby on her hip and slapped at a toddler tugging at her drooping skirt. "You're back at last," she snapped, and then, to Ellen's surprise, she burst into tears. "Thank the Lord for that," she had said, as she roughly brushed her tears away with the back of her hand. Ellen followed Mr. Murdock and the boys into the house. The woman did not seem to see her, but was scolding her husband as she hurried to the fireplace and picked up a big spoon. "In times like these, it ain't safe to ride to Amboy to sell leather. If you're dead, I got these 4 boys to raise." "The bootmaker paid me and we need the money." Mr. Murdock lifted his yellow beard and took some of the money from a bag that hung from a cord about his neck. "Nothing to be worried about." "Worried?" cried his wife in a high, shrill voice. "With all those redcoats around?" She banged her spoon as she stirred the pot of stew that hung over the fire. Her voice became low and firm. "Times were better before the war started, that's what I think." "Now, Ma, don't talk like that." Mr. Murdock pushed Ellen forward, but his wife paid her no mind, which means she didn't notice her, or didn't acknowledge her. As she stood waiting for the farmer's wife to notice her, Ellen looked around the log farmhouse. The whole house was just one big shadowy room, lighted by a fire in the hearth at one side. Pots and ladles and kettles of iron hung on hooks near the fireplace. In one corner stood a huge spinning wheel, and in the other corner was a big unmade bed with a trundle bed underneath it and a cradle beside it. A trundle bed, guys, is when you have a bed and a bed that slides from underneath the bed. When she saw that a ladder went up through a dark hole to the boys' bed in the loft, Ellen was glad that she wasn't spending the night in that cold place. Mistress Murdock was still upset as she put wooden bowls and earthened mugs on the table, which are clay mugs. She said times were better before the war started. Everything was peaceful, and we farmed out our farm and no soldier bothered us. She banged the pitcher of milk on the table. I say King George was all right. He didn't bother us none. Why did we want to change things? Mr. Murdock pushed Ellen toward the fire. He seemed to want to change the subject. I brought home a boy named Toliver who's mighty hungry. Ellen remembered to snatch off her cap and stuff it in her pocket before she nodded her head politely, as a boy would have done. The farmer's wife looked at her glumly, then looked into the pot of stew and gave a quick stir. There's enough, she said, if he ain't too hungry. Pa, go out and hide your horse in the woods. Supper has waited long enough. With his wooden milk pail in his hand, Mr. Murdock quickly pulled his cap over his bushy hair, hunched his shoulders, and stomped out the door. Boys, Mistress Murdock ordered, go help your pa. She pulled a bench up to the fire. Sit, she said to Ellen. Ellen hadn't known how hungry she was until she smelled that pot of stew. Meat and onions and turnips. What a wonderful supper for someone who hadn't eaten anything but oatcake since early morning. She stuffed her mittens in one of her pockets and carefully untied the blue bundle. This bread can dry out here by the fire while I eat supper. It's my grandfather's loaf of bread, she exclaimed to Mistress Murdock. It fell in the water. The woman looked at it. It's right soggy, she said. Not good for much. She picked up the wet kerchief and spread it out to dry on a pile of firewood. Your feet are soggy too, she said as she bent down to look at Ellen's shoes. And your breeches. Faith, you're wet to the skin, she cried, wiping her hands on her apron. Take off those breeches, Toliver, she ordered. We'll hang them by the fire too. Take off her breeches and risk that woman finding out she was a girl? Ellen was alarmed. How could she explain why she was dressed like a boy? Only spies and criminals went around pretending to be someone else. Oh, no, she cried in dismay. I'm going to Elizabethtown tonight. Elizabeth? The woman stared at her. Tonight in the dark? And in this kind of weather, you'd freeze to death. But I must go. Mr. Murdock said he'd ride me there. Ride you to Elizabeth. On a night like this. The farmer's wife clapped her hands to her head. What now? The man must have lost his wits. She gripped Ellen's shoulders roughly in her hand. Take off those breeches, boy. You're chilled to the bone. What ails you? Are you bashful? Ellen drew back. Someone is waiting for me, she began. Suddenly the woman picked her up, tossed her on the bed, and started to peel off her wet breeches. Ellen kicked her legs and tried to squirm away. At that, the woman's face went white with anger. There will be no riding out where those soldiers are tonight, she said through her tight lips. If he gets shot, I've got 4 boys to raise, so you can take off those breeches and let them dry. He's not going to Elizabeth, and neither are you. In desperation, Ellen pushed the woman's hand away, and grabbing the top of her breeches and kicking her feet, she worked her way to the edge of the bed. Mistress Murdock stepped back and looked at her. What's wrong with you, Toliver? She cried. Quickly, Ellen scrambled from the bed, ran to the door. She was glad to find that it was not bolted. She flung it open and darted out into the night, pulling up her breeches as she ran. Thank goodness she had not yet taken off her jacket or shoes. She flung through the gate and across the road and hid among the trees. It was not until the door swung closed that all was dark around her that she remembered. The loaf of bread. She had left it on the hearth. A wild fright came over her as she stood shivering in the dark, cold night. What would she do now? She couldn't tell Mr. Murdock. He was suspicious about the bread anyways. She couldn't go back into she couldn't go back to the door. That stubborn woman might take away all her clothes and give her a cornmeal sack for a nightdress. She was shaking with cold and fear and anger. How could she have forgotten the bread that she had guarded so carefully all day? How could she have been so stupid? Then a square of light broke into the darkness, and there stood Mistress Murdock in the open doorway. Here, pig! the woman said as she flung Ellen's loaf to the pig. "Turn that soggy old bread into pork." The door slammed, and all was dark again. Ellen could hear the pig grunt and snuffle around. When he found the bread, he would gulp it quickly, and in his greediness he would swallow the snuff box too. Ellen was afraid of pigs. She always walked clear of those lean, hungry public pigs who wandered about the New York streets and ate the garbage. She remembered the mean look of the pig who had chased her this morning. But now there wasn't a second to lose. She had to get the bread. She could feel her kneecaps shaking, and she couldn't make them stop as she raced across the road. If only there were more light from the pale stars overhead. She put out her hands to feel for the pig's prickly back, and when she felt it, she ran her fingers down its lowered head. But the thought of the sharp teeth made her snatch it away. The smell of him, the awful smell of him, made her gag. Again, she reached out her hands. He rumbled in his throat and gave her a shove with his hips. She ran her hands along the back again. He snorted angrily. Now her eyes had grown used to the dark, and she could tell that the bread was already in his mouth. She must grab for it. There was nothing else to do. Quickly, she snatched her cap from her pocket and swished it across his eyes, back and forth his eyes. The pig tossed his head and snorted in rage, which means anger. It was a terrifying sound, but when Ellen saw the bread fall from his mouth, she scooped it up quickly and darted out of his way. She was glad he was tied to a stake and couldn't charge at her. As she raced through the gate and down the road, her feet barely touched the ground. She heard the door open and Mistress Murdock call out, "You all right, Pa? You got the boys there with you?" But Ellen didn't turn back to look. Mistress Murdock couldn't see her running down the road, for she was out of sight with the loaf of bread in her trembling arms. She knew Grandfather's snuff box was still inside. She could feel it with her fingers that there was only one big bite gone, and not a very big bite at that. Sorry, I read that wrong. She could feel with her fingers that there was only one bite gone, and not a very big bite at that. Since she had no kerchief to wrap around it, she tucked it under her jacket, where it sat like a lump of ice against her stomach.